Dina.
Take care.
And Dina in the Army, they used to call me Don Arneroons, among other things. That's why I got used to learning how to spell people's names and asked them, can you tell me how to pronounce it one more time, please?
That's what
All right.
rehearsal was for, right?
I've been working on Anthony's name like for 2 months and I'm getting close.
You
You
made me
got it
spell his
perfect.
name wrong. I
Yeah,
swear.
All right, David.
Yes,
Let's
sir.
go ahead and start playing us in.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to our weekly show, Amram Reads Amram. I'm the Amram that's reading Amram, but that's just a small part of the whole program, which is to celebrate the book called Offbeat Collaborating with Kerouac, and also celebrates the wonderful chance I had not only to meet and to know and work with Jack, but 2 or 3 weeks after Jack and I met Woody Guthrie. This was way back in 1956. And the piece I was playing, The Lonesome Traveler, I used this instrument, the Chinese hulose, which I heard in Chengdu, China, when I was at a festival accompanying Kerouac, spoken in different languages. Came back, was at Woody Fest, and for some amazing reason, Kathy Woolsey suggested that Rad and I play together for her in some tiny little place down in Florida, Vero Beach. And as a result, I took this Chinese hulusai and I played this particular song with Rad and ended up a song that I had Woody used to sing, which an old traditional folk song, and ended up using that in a symphony that's going to be played by the Harvard Wind Orchestra. I mention all that because no career counselor would put all those things together. And say 60 years ago, if you met these two people, 60 years later, you'd be using something that ended up in a symphony. And the only reason I mention that is that was the spirit. And you see our special guest, Jim Canary, who comes on every week. His friend Jim Barber is also had the Route 66 exhibition, which is all about Jack's travels, the same road that Woody traveled. And we're going to celebrate the two great figures who in Europe are considered Woody's book, Bound for Glory, and Jack's books, two generic American authors. I repeat the word author, people who wrote books which stand on their own, that don't need a beat generation or anything else to justify, in Woody's case, their greatness as people, thinkers, influences who even surpassed their stereotypes and ended up inspiring us all to a higher level. So in 2020, they're not historic figures in a vault, but rather people who are living in spirit from what they did and the gifts they gave us, so we can use that as a foundation to be creative ourselves. That ends the sermon, you'll be glad to know. And we're going to continue on page 190 for those of you who might have this book. If you've stolen it from the library, chances are it's a different version, but this is the latest one that's published. And last week we were talking about how we began the CD in the 1990s that Jim Sampas and Lee Ronaldo produced of Jack reading Orosaba 210 Blues and Washington, D.C. Blues. Am I providing music for it? So here we go. And then we're going to have our special guests. And we want to thank Pamela Dickerson, without whom this show never would have happened because she thought of it, and the current producer and wizard, Mr. Anthony Demarbier, musician, poet, performance artist, songwriter in his own right, and a technical wizard. Also, of course, the wonderful Norton Wisdom, who does paintings and sketches throughout the night. And he's somebody that can do anything in the moment, and then he erases it and does something else that's even better. And once in a while, he sends us pictures of what he's done. He's an extraordinary artist and a joy to work with. So last week, I was saying to Jim, this is going to be an incredible CD, said Jim. Geffen Records has worldwide distribution. It will get Jack's words and your music everywhere. Well, it was worth the wait, I said. We waited a long time, and sure enough, it happened. A short while later, Jim called from Lowell, Massachusetts. David, I've got some bad news. Our man at Geffen Records, who was supporting the Kerouac CD, just called and told me a whole bunch of people at the company had just been fired. The new regime has no interest in Kerouac in any way. We have to take the project to another company so that it doesn't die in the warehouse the months before it's even released. Well, Jim, I said, we just have to wait a little longer. Whatever happens, remember, Beaver Harris, the great drummer from Pittsburgh, once told me, some critics say jazz will never be popular because the modern drummers play too many different rhythms and it's too late to be showing up. And when we do show up, they say we're too late. But when our music starts, it's always on time. Well, I hope you're not disappointed, Jim said. Well, whenever this does get released, no one will know why any of us went through all this to make it happen, I said. They'll just have to wait, and just as they do with Jack's words and my music, and it'll be right on time. I think you're going through all of this to get Jack's own voice and my music out there. I got to play with Jack again. I'm ready for more. And in order to do my book justice, I'm going to have to put on my reading glasses. Never wore any. Never wore any until I was 90, but that's what happens, folks, when the old speedometer keeps clicking in. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, but in Zoom, we're allowed to be spontaneous. Just a second. All right. As they say, the televangelists say, I can see again. I thank you for going through all this, Jim, to get Jack's own voice and my music out there. And I get to play with Jack again, and I'm ready for more. 2 years later, in 1998, 2 years later, Jim called me with some good news. Ryko Discs wants to make an entire CD of Jack's readings, taken from old tapes preserved in the archives of Jack's estate. Some of the tapes Jack had recorded himself on his own reel-to-reel tape recorder. Some were done by our mutual friend and Jack's old buddy from Columbia University days, Jerry Newman. We'll finish up our Saba 210 Blues, I said. I've listened back to it, and it's amazing, said Jim. I'd love to hear it, I said. I can't remember a lot of what I played. It sounded like a composition, said Jim. That's good, I said. Composed music should sound spontaneous, and spontaneous music should sound composed. We have a poem, Jack said, Washington, D.C. Blues. Almost 18 minutes long. It needs music throughout. We have a budget for musicians, so if you'd like to hire some good players, go ahead. I love that, I said. Let me read the poem. Jack sent me a photocopy of Washington, D.C. Blues and a cassette of Jack reading it. Jack sounded at his best. I felt like I was hanging out with him again. Since the poem hadn't been published, I kept the photocopy under my farm equipment catalog. I didn't want it added to the list of bootleg copies of the film and soundtrack of Pull My Daisy that had been floating around since 1959. I played the cassette for my kids. He sounds great, Daddy, said my second daughter, Adira, then 17. Now, when I read his writing in public at your concerts, I'll do a lot better. Jack was the best reader of his work, I said, and the best writer about his life. I'm so happy that you could hear him. He sounds so real, said Adira, and funny. I can see why you guys had such a good time together. He really sounds cool, said Alana, my first daughter, then 19. I like his voice. I like him more than rappers, said Adam, my 14-year-old. He's got some crazy ideas. I was happy that my own kids could relate to Jack's work through the communicative power of his voice. I was sure that their friends and contemporaries would too. I called Jim Sempus and said, I know what to do. We'll have two 3-hour sessions. The first group will be alto sax, guitar, bass, drums, congas, and me playing the piano, French horn, doumbek, shanai, penny whistles, and everything else. That will be for our jazz, Latin, world music sound. I'll get Jerry Dodgen on alto saxophone, my quartet with Vic Juris on guitar, Victor Venegas on bass. We'll get Johnny Almendra on drums and Candido on the congas. Jack used to see Candido when he played with Dizzy's band after Chano Pozo died in 1949. Great, said Jim. What will the second session be? We'll have our neoclassical ensemble. We can have Jerry Dodgen come back again to play alto sax, almost like Marcel Mule, the great classical French saxophone who used to do solos with the Boston Symphony when Jack still lived in Lowell, Massachusetts. Jack used to tell me how he loved that French way of playing the alto that was from another planet compared to the way Charlie Parker approached the instrument. Then we'll have a viola, a bassoon, and an oboe doubling on English horn. That's interesting, said Jim. An alto saxophone, viola, English horn, and bassoon. Well, it's the same instrumentation I used 39 years ago for the classical music segments of Pull My Daisy. And the biggest kick of all, I called the three classical players who recorded the original Pull My Daisy soundtrack to play this recording. Midhat Servaji, the violist, Jane Taylor on bassoon, and Ronnie Rosenman on oboe and English horn. They're all gonna make it. How can you coordinate the two different groups recording at different times, said Jim. I'll write everything out, I said. It will be like a ballet or an opera score. We can record it out of sequence, like a film score, and then fit it together. Washington, D.C. Blues was made up out of my notations on paper, which I did at the moment. Spontaneity and formality, side by side, Jack would have loved it. That's what we have done together and with others. And that's what we had to offer when so few thought that way. This will be different, I said. I can hardly wait to hear it, said Jim. I loved hearing the radio broadcast of E.G. Marshall reading Jack with your orchestral music from the Kennedy Center with the National Symphony. My Uncle John really liked it too. Well, this would be something else, I said. We've got Jack himself doing the readings, and his poems reflect a different part of his whole approach towards writing. It will be an extension of what we used to talk about doing. I sat home for hours listening to the tape of Jack's recording of Washington, D.C. Blues. The long 17-and-a-half-minute series of short poetic vignettes and his dynamic reading were mesmerizing. He sounded just like he did when we first began to play together. On the Road was still unpublished, and he was full of energy and laughter. I flashed back to when we would terrorize guests at various loft parties and disturb unwitting coffeehouse customers who thought we were two village moving men trying to be artsy. No one else back then would have dared to walk into a room full of strangers and take turns playing music on any available instrument, read poetry of their own and others in English and French, and make up scat story raps while sipping on brown bagged bottles of Thunderbird wine and flirting with women. Still, Jack always, and I not quite always, tried to maintain gentillesse, gentility, even if we sometimes appeared to be bulls in someone else's china shop. Il faut être gentil tout le temps. You got to be polite all the time, was our motto. Jack would say that in the same Lowell tinted New England accent that I was now listening to on this 1956 recording, the year I started to work with him. As I listened to him read Washington, D.C. blues, I remembered the gentle way Jack had of expressing himself. He was usually outshouted by most of his friends, so he never blew out his vocal cords by trying to outshout them. His speaking voice was beautiful, and he was a surprisingly good singer. When he wasn't reading aloud, scat singing, bashing out at the piano, or hammering on the bongos, he would sit quietly in the middle of pandemonium. His voice was like a magnet to women. If he was sitting between two women, he would speak softly and try to relate to both of them in an old fashioned, gentlemanly way that Carolyn Cassidy described as courtly. Hearing him all these years later reading Washington, D.C. blues reminded me of the light that he brought with him, which he shared with everyone around him. I wanted the music I wrote for this reading of Washington, D.C. blues to reflect the tapestry of the people and the places that were patched together like a crazy quilt in this series of short poems and vignettes. The piece was made up of a series of over 30 short readings of recollections and impressions that were like taking a trip to the countryside. I tried to frame the poems and the vignettes with music and at the same time make the whole reading flow and have the feeling of seamlessness. When I came to the studio for the first session, Jim Sampis and co-producer Lee Ronaldo of Sonic Youth both looked surprised to see me loaded down with folders of music as well as with all my instruments and a stopwatch. I don't know how you're possibly going to pull this one off, David, but I know you will, said Jim Sampis. Our first ensemble came into play. Candido, now approaching 80, still played the congas like no one else. Jack had seen him when he performed with Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and hundreds of other musicians. I first worked opposite Candido in the fall of 1955 when I was with the Charles Mingus Quartet, and Candido was a solo performer between our sets. He took me under his wing back then because he could see I was interested in what he was doing and respectful of him. He played on almost every recording of my own and concerts with my quartet and symphony concerts, which I conducted. ¿Qué tal, Candy? I asked. How you doing, man? Más viejo que ayer y más joven que mañana. Older than yesterday and younger than tomorrow, he said, smiling. Esta dia Kerouac. Today's Jack Kerouac, I said. Jack Kerouac, he said. You always talk of him and sing that funny song you wrote with him. Today we play with him. That's good. Jim put on a tape of Jack reading for all the musicians to hear as they entered the Manhattan Beach studios to unpack. Jack's voice filled the room. Man, he sounds great, said Vic Juris, the young guitarist who had played with me since 1978. I've really been looking forward to this. His reading is so musical. He sounds like he's right next door, said Victor Venegas, our bassist. When did he record this? 1956, I said, at Bob Giraud's house in Washington, D.C. Okay, David, we're ready, said Jim Sampis. Let's begin recording. I had the ensemble play the Baines theme. It was bittersweet, similar to the melody of the second movement of my violin concerto, melancholy, but still full of hope. I knew Jerry Dodgin's artistry could make this simple song like theme complement all the feelings that Jack's series of poems evoked in one long 17.5 minute piece. After we finished playing it, I saw Jim Sampis, Lee Ronaldo, and the engineer smiling. That's perfect, David, said Jim. Let's record it. We continued to record section by section and finished the whole session ahead of time. Since we have an extra 10 minutes, I want to do something for old time's sake, I said. Let me redo one section we've already recorded and play a new part behind Jack's narration on the French horn, the way I often did. There's one part of the soundtrack in Pull My Daisy where you can hear him half singing a mournful ditty, keening and wailing, while I made up a second part that mirrored that old country lost in the mountains sound that he was creating. I think the sound of my horn and his voice will pull people into the imagery of this poem without them knowing it's happening. I'm not quite sure I get it, said Jim. But if you feel it's something Jack would want to do, go for it. We queued up the tape and got ready to record over the take that already existed. This better be a good one, whispered Victor Venegas. The one we were racing was mean. I hope your chops are up. This one's for Jack, I said. He'll give me a psychic temporarily chops transplant. The tape rolled, and I knew I couldn't miss. As I played, listening to Jack's recorded voice through my earphones, I could literally feel his presence just above my left shoulder, like the spirit that perches itself above the shoulder of the Indians in Mexico and the American Southwest. Nice, Dave, said Victor Juris when I finished. You sound like you've been practicing. Next thing you know, you're going to actually have a rehearsal someday with the quartet. You're all so great, I'd just rather let it happen, I said. Whenever the four of us play as a group, or when we add something special, who's ever tuned into really listening, help us. We can't go wrong. Naturally, when we rehearse for my symphony programs, we're part of a large group that has to rehearse. They wouldn't be comfortable if didn't have any idea of what we were going to do at the concert. When you played in the small orchestra I conducted for the ballet score I composed for Jacques d'Amboise, we had a bunch of rehearsals so the dancers could get used to my music, how we played it, and how we could adjust to them. That gave the dancers confidence to know that they could soar and we'd be right there with them, whatever they did. But when it's just us playing at a concert, you're all so great and creative. I know it will always happen. All of us know how to follow each other. And when the music itself takes over, we follow that. That's the same thing Jack and I did every time we got together. Mingus told me my first week with him in 1955, practice at home. Having rehearsals don't mean anything. Go home and woodshed. When you come to the gig tonight, you're here to create. I wish more band leaders thought that way, said Vic Juris. I think they would if they could follow the Plains Indian saying, the leader is the follower. Kerouac came up at a time when the jazz philosophy made a contribution to the whole society with its way of looking at things, I said. Young people to know about this. I thank you guys for being here. You were all wonderful. We'll have another adventure into the unknown at our Central Park concert from Cairo to Kerouac. We'll all have a reunion, and the actor Keir Delay will read Kerouac, and we'll play for about 2 hours of wailing music till the Parks Department tells us to stop. Tomorrow I'm recording with the three original players of the Pull My Daisy original film score. Another first, said Jerry Dodson. See you tomorrow. We'll be smoking in Central Park, said Victor Juris. I'll be there early, said Vic Venegas. Cógelo suave, baby. Gracias, said Candido. I mean, take it easy, man, and thank you. This was a ball. Come hear my band at Gonzalez restaurant, said Johnny Almendra. It's all just starting, I said. It's a whole new day. Tomorrow we'll record with the chamber music and we'll put it all together. I went home and spent most of the night going over the rest of the music. I thought about how my sister Mariana and I used to sit on the floor at our farmhouse in Feasterville, Pennsylvania in the late 1930s, putting together jigsaw puzzles. I remembered our squeals of delight when we would finally put the last piece into place. I could see a perfect picture. They gave us no indication of our struggles in assembling it. This is what it was like fitting together the rest of the music I had composed for Washington, D.C. Blues. If I could have had the chance to do it live, Jack and I would have been able to adjust to one another at any given moment and make whatever we were doing sound rehearsed. But Jack's recording was fixed in time. It sounded natural and was read as well as I ever heard him in a recorded performance because he was recording himself for himself. It was a one-way street that I had to make into a thoroughfare musically, implying a give and take by responding to every nuance of his reading. We couldn't change 1 second of what he had already recorded without ruining the perfect pace that he had established. All my experience in composing for the theater, film, and ballet, when you had to adjust to someone else's creativity, made it possible for plan out this jigsaw puzzle and sound. I knew I had to figure out in advance how to put it all together. When we started recording, there would be a calm atmosphere in which the musicians could discover personal moments of hidden beauty as they played the written notes. They could bring the music to life in the same way that Jack could make his words sing in 1,000 different ways. The next morning, I got up early and drove back to New York City. The musicians arrived one by one. Midhat Serbaji, who knew Jack and our forays together at Lucien Carr's jam sessions in 1958, a year before he played on the soundtrack of Pull My Daisy, came early. Midhat loved Jack's work and always appreciated Jack's down-home Lowell soul and his strong regional accent. Unlike Jack's friend and one-year classmate from Horace Mann Prep School, William F. Buckley, who traded his Texas roots and learned to speak like an English butler, Jack retained the speech patterns of his youth. When I arrived, Jim was playing the tape of Jack reading over the playback system in the studio. He wanted the musicians to hear Jack as they walked in. My God, that's wild, said Midhat. That guy sounds just like Kerouac. Who is that? He's great. That's Jack, I said. Come on, man. Don't put me on, said Midhat. He's been dead for 30 years. It's Jack, I said. This is an old recording he made on his home tape machine in 1956. His nephew, Jim Sampis and Lee Ronaldo, got it remastered and cleaned it up. Isn't that fantastic? It's fantissimo, said Midhat. Man, that's spooky. It sounds like he's right here. Let me see my music. I hope you wrote something good for the viola. Midhat sat down, crinkled up his nose, adjusted his glasses, pulled down his hat, and began practicing his music. The rich sound of his viola, played in his personal, heartwarming style, filled the small room of the recording studio. Jane Taylor arrived carrying her bassoon case and greeted us all with smiles, jokes, and hugs. She was one of the most beloved musicians in New York City, the founder and still member of one of the oldest and best woodwind quintets in the world. When she recorded on the Pull My Daisy soundtrack back in 1959, she was already a musician who brought freshness and idealism to every place she traveled on her constant tours. She toured the globe, bringing chamber music to new audiences and inspiring two generations of students to always think positively and exceed all expectations. Her dark eyes had the serene glow you find in the eyes of holy men and loving parents. Well, fellas, you're still all looking robust. Is that Kerouac reading? It's hard to ever forget that voice, even after 40 years. I'm glad you're here, Jane, I said. Wait till Ronnie Rosenman comes in and sees us all together. The Pull My Daisy Vegetarian Chamber Music All Stars reunited. A few minutes later, Ronnie Rosenman arrived. Since 1959, when all four of us had recorded the soundtrack for Pull My Daisy, Ronnie had been with the New York Philharmonic, appeared as a soloist around the world, played in chamber music ensembles, and was a highly respected composer and popular teacher. Like all of us, it never occurred to him to slow down. He lived for music, and all the places making music brought him to. This is amazing, said Ronnie. It's like a high school reunion. We have to get a picture of this. My young students, now that I played on the Pull My Daisy soundtrack, they ask me all about Jack Kerouac. I'm trying to show them how to phrase, how to project their sounds in all situations we become part of, how to make the proper read for the style that's right for each composer whose work you're playing. And they're asking me about Jack Kerouac. Yvette Roberts, a Memphis-born photographer whom I knew from Farm Aid, arrived carrying her cameras. A renowned photographer, she had the gift of making people she was photographing feel at ease. I wouldn't miss this for the world, she said. I've got great shots of you and Willie Nelson and Neil Young at Farm Aid. I'll shoot the recording session and you can use it in your book. I introduced Yvette to everyone and we posed for a group photo. While we stood together and Yvette shot her pictures, we could hear Jack's voice over the studio speaker reading to himself, now to us, and eventually to the whole world. His unpublished poem, Washington, D.C. Blues, was now alive again, and I got the eerie feeling this must have been somehow fated, even though we both worked so hard not to end up like Diogenes hiding our light beneath the barrel. Like you say, there's no rush, I would say to Jack when he agonized over visions of Cody not being published while he was alive. And Marlon Brando never responded after expressing an interest in starring in a feature film version of On the Road. Be patient. Sois tranquille. It's never too late. Jack would admonish me when I would rail against the conductors and recording companies who would turn my orchestral scores and recordings years later, still unheard and unopened. Our day will come, said Jack over and over. Stick to your guns. His voice that surrounded us as we stood in the studio was full of affirmation and life. It was the voice of a young man talking to himself and to the whole world, if the world cared to listen. Like just about everyone else and everything else that we did together, his reading welcomed everyone to the party. After Ebit finished photographing us, she went into the control room to take pictures through the glass partition. We were now ready to record. The same opening theme that I had written for the ensemble the day before was used again, scored this time for English horn doubling on oboe, viola, bassoon, alto saxophone, and myself playing occasional piano and other instruments. Some of the music sounded almost Elizabethan to match the elegance of Jack's words, much like portions of the music for Pull My Daisy, when I wrote a sprightly minuet and trio to accompany the bishop and his wife's visit to the apartment of Carolyn and Neil Cassidy. We did almost all the music in one or two takes. all the players were so in tune with one another that each small piece sounded as if we'd been on tour and knew it cold. Good stuff, said Midhat. You've got promise. Will you guarantee to call me back in 40 years? Said Ronnie Rosenman. I'll tell my students to start calling you and asking what Jack Kerouac was really like. Yvette took one more farewell photo of us, and then Jim and I went over the tapes and assembled everything in order. We'll meet tomorrow, he said. We can hear it with a fresh ear and mix it. Jim left, and I sat in the studio collecting all the music I had written and my instruments. Where do you go from here? Said the young engineer. Home, I said. I remembered the victory celebration Jack and Jerry Newman and I had after completing the recording of the narration with my original improvised music for Pull My Daisy. It took an hour to record. Then Jerry recorded for hours of me singing, playing, telling stories, jokes, making everything up off the top of our heads, with each of us accompanying one another. Like so much of what I did in the early days, I let it go, went on to the next adventure, and let it all float downstream. I lived from day to day and only saved my music I had written down and my instruments. I never worried about the well running dry or growing old. I thought that only happened to other people. After I got my family, I started trying to organize the rest of my life as well as my music. Somewhere, a copy must exist. I've said that to myself and others thousands of times over the past 4 decades. There must be a copy somewhere of that midnight to morning landslide of words and music that we created for our own entertainment. Just as Pull My Daisy was a glorified home movie that was now considered to be a document of our era, I realized that the recording we did that night would be fun now to be a document of what Jack and I did for years whenever the spirit moved us. Perhaps it was all for the best. If those 1959 tapes had been preserved and bootlegged, there's a good chance that some of the best moments might have been edited out. With modern technology, anyone with his own homemade studio could add tracks of music that would have no relationships to what we have done. A commercial recording could also be issued altering what Jack and I had done. There is a precedent for this. A recent film biography of Charlie Parker features some of Bird's priceless recordings. His solos remained intact, but the rest of the recording had been electronically altered. Someone, undoubtedly with good intentions, had removed the entire rhythm section that was part of the original sessions and re recorded the same performance with different musicians. Charlie Parker's solos were preserved, but he was now playing with a different band. No one seemed to realize that even though the new rhythm section was composed of great musicians and well recorded, Parker would have played totally different solos if he had played with them. He always based his spontaneous creations on who he was playing with at the moment and how he felt at that moment. Hollywood's addiction to plastic surgery was now permeating the music industry. My music could easily be altered electronically or completely replaced by the latest Euro trash techno pop funk band that not only wouldn't listen to Jack, but whose members wouldn't even listen to each other. A battery of lawyers and self appointed youth culture experts of the moment would probably bring in a battery of drum machines and electronic effect to doom Jack's natural lyrical reading into a hell worse than any he suffered in his darkest days. I felt some sense of closure for the first time since 1959, just because those tapes we made with Jerry Newman had disappeared. Jack and I wouldn't have altered them, but we would have selected the ones that we felt were best. I realized how lucky we were both were in 1998 to finally have a recording issued that represented both of us at our best and still collaborating. Even though Jack couldn't adjust his readings to my music, I could adjust my music to his readings in a way that could achieve the same effect because of our years together. The recordings I had just completed sounded remarkably natural. Each section flowed effortlessly into the next. We had all spent a great deal of time and given a lot of painstaking effort to ensure that this new recording would sound effortless and spontaneous. Jim Sampas, Lee Ronaldo, and I also were determined not to have those readings with music sound like a New Year's Eve bash in a mental institution, poorly played and out of tune. All three of us agreed that the idea of the recording was not to reinforce the old image of the tone deaf beatnik. This new recording presented Jack in his prime, accompanied by the best musicians I knew, produced with enough of a budget to record under optimum conditions. There was nobody involved in the creation of this beautiful new CD who was in the position of being able to come in after it was finished and ruin the results. The producers, my own best work as a composer performer, and Jack's glorious reading were now documented for all time and available to a worldwide audience. Well, maybe the great career planner in the sky has a reason for all this, I thought. Certainly, other work on Jack's behalf that I had done a few years earlier with Jim Sampas had also come out remarkably well. I had done music for Kerouac's CD as an audiobook of Jack's beloved Visions of Cody. Graham Parker had been the narrator, and both the events were done in a short time and turned out extremely well. They were the very best I was capable of doing, and Graham was fantastic. Jack's readings of Washington, D.C. blues and Orosaba 210 blues were magnificent renditions. All of us involved felt that this new CD would set a high standard for how to combine music and poetry in a natural way. We all felt that this recording would paint a better picture in sound of what Jack and I had pioneered as a new way to combine music and the spoken word. We never called it jazz poetry. We called it poetry music, music poetry. Now it didn't matter what anyone called it. No brand name or packaging could alter the income, the outcome. And next week we'll go on, but right now we have the joy of what we call an intermission, which was Pamela's idea. And our special guest is someone who is such an extraordinary person in her own right, working as a school teacher. She has the ability and the good sense and the grace and charm and wits to be able to take any situation and turn it into something positive. We met when she was the director in 2005 of the Woody Guthrie Folk Festival, or called Woody Fest, in Okemah, Oklahoma. And it was just an extraordinary experience being there. And for those first few years, I had some of the great country artists and composers like the great Jimmy LaFave and the Burns sisters and so many other people reading Kerouac with music, doing it in a splendid way. And she endorsed that and allowed the concert to have that included for an audience that probably had never heard anything like that before. The performers were so terrific and the whole festival was so terrific that they really enjoyed it. And I realized Jack's message was coming to a whole new audience in a new way. Then she was chosen, one of those rare, wise choices, to become the executive director of the new Woody Guthrie Center, which not only has an extraordinary exhibit of the entire life of Woody and the entire life of early Oklahoma from whence he came, it also is joined, included by the wonderful collection of Bob Dylan's work, who loved Woody and loved Jack Kerouac, and also the works of Phil Oakes and a contemporary and great, great songwriter, and someone named Tom Paxton, who's from Oklahoma originally, who's become one of the major songwriters and has been for the last 50 years. It's just one of the most wonderful places. And before she comes and speaks, I want to remind those of you who might have tuned in late that in Europe, in Asia, and even parts of the United States, people consider Jack Kerouac and Woody Guthrie to be great authors. Woody wrote a book called Bound to Glory that's just extraordinary. And of course, Jack's many books, aside from, in addition to On the Road, are there. And they're considered, especially in Europe, to be representative of some of the finest writings about America, along with John Steinbeck and Walt Whitman and Carson McCullers and other great writers of our time. Each had their own voice. Woody came from a tiny town called Okima, Oklahoma, and Jack came from a mill town in the French-Canadian quarter known as Lowell, Massachusetts, and they both fell in love with America and made us fall in love with America all over again, and still do to this day. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our wonderful guest who can tell you something about what she's done, show you two great videos from the wonderful Woody Guthrie archives, which are part of the place that she is in charge of. And then we'll have a little discussion about Woody and Jack and all good things. And then we have our special guest, Jim Canary, who's the person who keeps the scroll, the conservator of the scroll, and his special surprise guest who made a wonderful documentary about Route 66 with both Woody and Jack adored at different times. That was the old trail before superhighways came into being. So please welcome, all the way from Tulsa, Oklahoma, the one and only Dina McLeod.
Hi,
Welcome, Dina.
Hi, friends. How are you?
Excited to have you here today, Dina.
This is the best way to close up a weekend, right? Just hang out with some friends and listen to David read. What could be better?
I was thinking that while all this was going on, like I feel like a kid in a candy store with some favorite people. And I look forward to one day coming out to see you in Oklahoma.
Absolutely. When the world kind of turns at least partially right side up again, both pandemic wise and politically, maybe we could have a gathering. It would be great. But I did send a couple of videos that we made. Whenever things started closing down, I wanted to have some virtual tours just available for us to post. So I sent some of those to David and Anthony so that we could share those with you. And for those of you who haven't been to Tulsa to see the Woody Guthrie Center, it'll give you a little taste of what we're doing in Tulsa.
For the Navajo Nation, outside investment
At the Woody
equals
Guthrie
more
Center, we
independence
have the only
for a
permanent
community that
exhibit in
all too
Oklahoma
often
that's
loses
dedicated
its
to
young
the Dust Bowl
professionals to
experience.
life
You
outside
sit on
the
the front
reservation.
porch, put on the goggles, and you, in the virtual world, are experiencing the anticipation of watching one of the worst dust storms
The
approaching you.
reservation's
You see the
second
impact
largest
it
urban
has on the
area is
environment
Tuba
around
City.
you, on
Its
the
Navajo
animals.
name means
And
scattered or winding
it
water.
could be a little bit
and here,
startling,
some pockets of
and
land over
which is
underground
good. We want
streams
people to
flourish.
understand the impact
But
that humans
residents on the
have on their
outskirts have no
environment.
way
And
of
since this was a
accessing nor
man-made
purifying the
ecological
water.
disaster,
Many are without
stress
running
the need
water
to
at
care
all
for the land.
and rely
So
on local
those
wells
people
or
who
haul tanks of water for
left
themselves and their
this region
livestock.
to get away from the dust storms,
Despite the scope
to
of their
survive,
communal land,
were
farming is
often
almost
greeted at the
impossible
border
due
of
to lack of water
California by
access.
what was termed the
Tuba
bum
City
blockade.
Councilman Joshua
Policemen
LeVar
who were
Butler
stationed at
says some
the
aspects of the
state
bill will continue to sell people
borders
short.
to
people have
check to see if
an
people had
issue
money
with
before they would
water
allow
and
them
the
into the state.
acreage of water
If
that
you didn't have
we are going to be
money, if you
limited
didn't
to.
have that
It
do-re
They're
mi,
both running at the
you
same
better get on back
time.
to where you came
Navajo
from.
pipeline.
But
And
They're both running at the same time. Since it's Zoom and we don't have a plane to catch, Jim, could we start those again and do one at a time? You had both of them running at the same time, which is interesting. But that'd be even more interesting if we could hear one at a time. So, folks, this will be take 2 of those 2 wonderful
In its
videos.
But he was
shadow,
also
there's a
seeing the
complex
way
rationing system.
that
This will be take 3 of the wonderful 2 videos. And fortunately, it's Sunday night. No one has a plane to catch, and there are no planes going anywhere anyway. So just sit back and relax, folks. We'll get it figured out in a moment. And if not, we'll just continue and Dina can tell us about it. Let's try one more time.
At the Woody Guthrie Center, we have the only permanent exhibit in Oklahoma that's dedicated to the Dust Bowl experience. You sit on the front porch, put on the goggles, and you, in the virtual world, are experiencing the anticipation of watching one of the worst dust storms approaching you. You see the impact it has on the environment around you, on the animals, and it could be a little bit startling, and which is good. We want people to understand the impact that humans have on their environment. And since this was a man-made ecological disaster, stress the need to care for the land. So those people who left this region to get away from the dust storms to survive were often greeted at the border of California by what was termed the bum blockade. Policemen who were stationed at the state borders to check to see if people had money before they would allow them into the state. If you didn't have money, if you didn't have that do-re-mi, you better get on back to where you came from. But the reason it's important to the Woody Guthrie Center is because of the impact it had on Woody becoming a social activist as a spokesperson for his people. He was in Pampa, Texas during Black Sunday, the worst of the dust storms. He saw people around him who literally thought the world was coming to an end. And then he traveled to California where he was on the radio. But he was also seeing the way that the people from Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado were being treated. They were in migrant camps, starving. And the disconnect of those who had and those who didn't have anything was so huge that Woody knew he had to speak for his people. He was also on the radio receiving thousands of fan letters from his show. And he knew that his voice was reaching people and that he could make a difference for those migrants, for the disenfranchised workers who were his people. And he chose to use his voice to speak for them. Those people who felt that they had no voice, Woody Guthrie became their voice because of this experience.
Stand by for the second video.
Thank you, Anthony.
While Anthony's getting that video up, I can just say if you go there, you'll be able to sit in the chair, put on earphones, and experience what it's like to be in a dust storm. And that blows the mind of even the most itinerant person who's never read a book, listened to a song, sung, danced, or done anything, because suddenly you say, wow, these people, including Woody Guthrie, went through this. They survived. They came back. Some of them stayed, and they all brought with them that energy and spirit of survival that makes us be able to deal with now.
Of course, the heart of the Woody Guthrie Center are the original handwritten lyrics to This Land Is Your Land, originally titled God Blessed America, in response to Kate Smith's idealized version of Irving Berlin's song God Bless America that was all over the airwaves whenever Woody was writing this. This is right after Woody had traveled from Pampa, Texas to Los Angeles and then had trekked across the country to New York, nearly freezing to death in Philadelphia, by the way. And while he thought, yes, this is an amazing land and we have so many blessings, it's beautiful, he also saw his people and he saw some problems with the way they were being treated. Things like signs that said no trespassing when there was a field full of orchards and fruits and vegetables and people on the other side were starving. Why can't we go in there and share the bounty of this land? So this was his response. And while a lot of people know this as a happy sing-along song from school, The sing-along versions don't include the verses that are our favorites. The ones about as I went walking, I saw a sign that said private property, but on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. Or those commentaries on seeing people in line at the relief office. And as they stood there hungry, I stood there wondering, is this land made for you and me? Woody was pretty direct about what he was thinking at this time. But honestly, this is an observation on what he was seeing. At the bottom, he writes, all you can write is what you see. That's exactly what he was doing. The very next day, he wrote a song called Women's Hats. He was sitting in a second-story apartment, watching all of the women walking down the street and the different kinds of hats that they were wearing. So he wrote an observation piece on women's hats. So all you can write is what you see. What do you see? What are you going to write? So we currently have 3 exhibit cases celebrating the 80th anniversary of Woody writing This Land Is Your Land. As part of the history, in this case, we have the sheet music from Irving Berlin's God Bless America. We have a photo of where Woody would have been staying at Hanover House right here. An album from the Carter family of When the World's on Fire. It sounds a lot like the melody of This Land Is Your Land. And the song that he wrote the next day, Women's Hats, right here. And also during that week, he wrote They Laid Jesus Christ in His Grave. He was writing about everything during this week, everything he was observing, the human condition, the way we were sharing things, everything he was thinking, he was writing about. I really love that about Woody's legacy. It didn't have to be, everything didn't have to be very deep and dramatic or insightful. Some of it's playful. And some of his most interesting music are the playful things. But then there are some really serious ones too. So he covers all bases.
That's really beautiful to see and feel like you're there.
Yeah, that's why we did different. I just kind of went to different sections of the gallery and did little short tours. They're on our YouTube channel should you want to look a little bit more deeply into those. And I just again took different sections, including a special spotlight area that currently is an exhibit called Folk the Vote. That is an exploration of music and politics. You know, we understand that music has always been used as a rallying cry for politics or political initiative. Sometimes that's a problem whenever people use the music without permission. You know, the song most often misused as a political rallying cry is Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. That is not a patriotic song. It's a song questioning treatment of Vietnam veterans. So we have Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA outfit that's on exhibit, which was a lot of fun to dress a mannequin in Bruce's. I will not lie to you, dressing a mannequin in Bruce Springsteen's jeans, that was an okay thing for me to do for a day. That was a good day. And then some other items from Ani DeFranco, things from People's Songs and the Wallace Campaign. So it's you can go in and explore on our YouTube channel and just take a little virtual tour while things are still, weird. So
we wanted to run Bruce Springsteen actually doing This Land Is Your Land with his talk before, because he kind of encompasses so many things that are going on now. Mm-hmm. So with your permission, maybe a little bit later on, we could play that during the show.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So there's a friend of yours or two on the call. We have Jim Canary and Jim Farber. Maybe we could say hello.
Hello.
Just means, hi, Jim.
Hey, is Jim on?
Did he disappear, Jim Farber?
You haven't muted it. You're in.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, there's Doug Yeager. Hi, Anthony. First. Well, he's disappeared for now, so I'm going to call him and see if he's coming back.
Okay.
Okay, in the meantime, accepting the award for for James, I'd like to ask Dina, since we had planned on speaking a little bit about the Woody Guthrie Festival and Woody Guthrie and Jack and how they relate. The interesting thing is that Woody mentioned he never belonged to the Communist Party or any party, that he was just for all people. It was not an either or, and that he was just interested in human beings and the planet and people. And Kerouac was exactly the same way. He said just before he died, I'm not a yippie or a yuppie or a warmonger or anything. He said, I'm a puppy. I'm in the middle. Neither Jack nor Woody felt that they had to have us versus them, but rather all of us being together. And even the Native American people in Oklahoma, Joy Harjo said to me, even though we feel the land was given to us by the great creator, Woody Guthrie was the first person outside of Will Rogers who ever was a public figure who told the whole world in his song Oklahoma Hills, way down yonder in the Indian Nation, ride my pony on the reservation, Oklahoma Hills, where I was born. And he was the first person to mention with pride that he lived in a place that had Native American traditions and heritage and welcomed people. And Jack was the same way, and he was considered by the intellectual literary establishment after they were squashed into being beatniks, that because he loved his mother, was a devout Catholic, and was patriotic, that he'd become some kind of right-wing activist north of Attila the Hun. And actually, Jack was for anybody and everybody. And their works have proven that they are beyond those limited categories. And politicians have always used artists for their own benefit. Very often they even have to, the political candidates are sued for using people's songs without their permission and without their agreement. So I'd like to ask you, Dean, if I may, that you could probably tell a lot of people who don't even know where Tulsa, Oklahoma is, or who Woody Guthrie was, the fact that there's a larger picture than what television tells us or what history tells us are the branded categories that both Jack and Woody suffered, and the fact that their work and who they were and what they'd said and what they do transcended that.
And just going back to the very first year that we did the Woody Guthrie Folk Festival in Woody's hometown of Okemah, which was 1998. And that first year, there were still some older folks who, I know there was a particular bank president who had a sign in his window that, no communists welcome. I mean, there was still that lingering label of communist for Woody, but Woody was never a member of a political party. His stance was right wing, left wing, chicken wing. It don't matter to me. And he considered himself a communist, somebody who spoke for the common people. It's not, and what he was doing was writing and defending not a political ideology, but a humanist perspective, which is the same as Jack was doing. That it wasn't worrying about whether you were right wing, left wing, communist, socialist, whatever label you want to have applied to you. It was, how can I help people? How can I share the message of these disenfranchised people? And you can call me whatever you want. And in fact, Woody addresses that on the lyrics of Pretty Boy Floyd. That's just, lovely handwritten lyrics. And he's turned the paper on its side and written a message on the side margins that is addressing the way that people are calling him. He said, people keep calling me a communist. If standing up for the common people means you want to call me that, whatever, call me what you want. Just help each other, take care of each other. You know, that's it. It was just a message of, you know, of the knowledge that he was hearing these things being said about himself that were not true, but he was also not going to fight that perception that someone would want to apply a label to him. And he just said, call me whatever you want, as long as you're helping people. I don't care. And I think that that's one of the things that I so admire about Woody, is that he took himself out of the equation and didn't come to his own defense to say, oh, no, 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 I'm not this and I'm not this. This is what I am. He said, I don't care what you call me at all. There are people who are struggling and we need to help them. So whatever you are, help these people. You know, and I love I think that, and you know, this has been occurring to me, and it was actually brought up. We had a Zoom call for the local, our Tulsa attraction leaders have Zoom calls just to check on how everybody's doing with reopening, blah, blah, blah. And the local head of our county health department was on the call. And it was interesting, even coming from a scientist medical perception, whenever he was talking about the fact that things aren't going to return to normal, because what has happened during the pandemic is that it has been illuminated. Our society has had things illuminated that are pretty ugly. And it has to do with people not being willing to sacrifice a small portion of what they consider their rights and their freedoms to protect the most vulnerable people in our society. And that the divisiveness that we've got in our society that is even keeping us from taking care of one another means that we need to pay attention to this illumination and apply a little Woody Guthrie-ism to it. And hey, let's take care of each other. So it was really interesting for me to hear that. I mean, I knew that's what I thought as well, but to have somebody in the community who's not a Woody Guthrie person, who's not, he's a scientist, he's a medical doctor, and he's saying, we've had some illumination on who we are as a people during this pandemic, and we need to think about it before we say we're going to go back to normal, because normal is not good.
And I think, Dina, that's so beautifully said. And Jack, in his way, felt the same way when he was a follower, which he always told me, of St. Francis philosophy and of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's something Sonny Rollins, of all people, told me is in every major religion in the world. And as Pete Seeger said, for the bird to fly successfully, the left and the right wing must find a way to work in harmony. And as the Cheyenne people said in the famous slogan of theirs, respect, love, and sharing, the Indian way. So the idea of making us versus them is great for merchandising T-shirts, consumer products, drugs, and recordings, books, and all kinds of junk. And that's fine. However, there's also something known as keeping it for real, and that has to do with every person being sacred, every person's way of praying being sacred, every person's heritage being beautiful, and learning to love ourselves and learn, love and respect other people. That's not such a big deal. And all the major religions say that. So that is hopefully something that we can look forward to. And when you study ancient history, and ancient literature, which Woody did, he was a brilliant guy. When I met him in 1950, he said, "Hey, fellas, how you doing?" But he might have talked with a different way than people speak at Oxford University. But he was what they called in the vernacular a heavy cat. He was a real intellectual, a dreamer, a fantastic poet, an amazing graphic artist. And Kerouac was the same way, even though he wore a lumber jacket like all French Canadian heritage folks do to honor their grandparents who were bûcherons, woodcutters. and spoke with a Lowell accent and spoke French comme un français canadien, not like je suis les gens qui a étudié à l'accordion. They were both correct in the way they spoke, the way they dressed, because of the way they wrote and the way they thought and felt was for and with anybody and everybody. That's easy to say, hard to do, but that's what we all have to do. And I think, and the beautiful part is with all the peregrinations and craziness, they are appreciated with no merchandising on their behalf all these years later more than ever. And all the people who dismiss them as being either beatniks or commie pinko troublemakers have all had their chance to do that. And all those people are currently retired or expired. So we can only sing Woody's song, So Long, It's Been Good to Know You, and allow ourselves to get some of that beauty. And Woody's children's songs, his Hanukkah songs, which he wrote because he married a woman of the Jewish faith, are now being acknowledged online by the Forwards and a lot of other Jewish publications as being the best Hanukkah songs ever written. This was a guy who was brought up as a devout churchgoer, and Jack, who was accused of everything in the world, is now being celebrated by people who have a completely different viewpoint, not as Mr. Beatnik, doctor of the hippies and king of the beat generation, but rather as a wonderful writer and a spiritual person. And that's why it was so exciting to come to Woody Fest in the heart of Oklahoma, in the hills of Oklahoma, and have Woody stuff read by all these terrific singer-songwriters, most of whom were from the South, and kill them because it was for real.
Yeah, well, and I think Jack and Woody. First of all, they were kindred spirits in that they were writing such observation pieces about where they were and the people that they encountered. I mean, they were reporting whenever they were writing. But it's also interesting. A lot of times, I'm asked, was Woody and then this adjective applied to Woody Guthrie? And my answer is always, I just kind of look at whoever is asking, saying, are you seriously asking me to put Woody Guthrie in a box? That he was this. I said, he was an enigma. He was constantly evolving, constantly changing because he was an empath. And he understood being able to put himself in another person's shoes. And most of our creatives are able to do that. It's just those who are able to do that to the extent that Woody was and that Kerouac was, those are the geniuses. Those are the people who can speak for humanity rather than this group of people.
It's funny, when I was asked by Nora Guthrie, who's Woody and Arlo, and Jody, the three of them, to write the symphonic variations on a song by Woody Guthrie, they said they didn't want a piece of trasho, pop, schlock, ghost-written junk elevator music to be played in the supermarket, but actually a real piece of music. I said, well, maybe I could do something like Brahms' variations on a theme by Haydn. And Nora suggested, well, whatever you do, use as the theme for the variations This Land, because that's the ultimate song that we know him by with all the great songs. And then she told me, which a lot of people don't know, that when they were brought up as kids, her mom, Marjorie, and Woody used to play Aaron Copland all the time because he was doing the music for that wonderful ballet that where he used the great folk song of the in his ballet that his Marjorie danced in, and that they listened to Brahms and Beethoven. That Woody, when he was a little kid, his sister, who passed away, whose button I have right here, told me that they were one of the first families in Okemah to have a phonograph, and they used to listen to opera and ballet music, and they were brought up reading and listening to all kinds of stuff. So when it's sort of musical, I wouldn't say snobs, let's just say people with a limited idea of what surrounds us said, well, that guy just used three chords. He wasn't how can you take a three-chord song? I said, all he needed was three chords for one of the great songs that has gone around the world. And those people, because they found a simple way to deliver their message, doesn't diminish their importance. And the beauty of I think, of Woody's work as a writer, as a songwriter, as a singer, as a sculptor, as a raconteur, and everything that Jack did in his writing and in his paintings, which are amazing, and in the books and poems he wrote, and in his hanging out with other people, was to provide inspiration for all of them, all of us, to use that as a point of departure, which they did, taking the beauties of the old world and incorporating the beauties of the new world and finding a way to put them together, not as a goulash, schlocko, crossover junk, homogenized plastic surgery type creation, Frankenstein monster, but just as what people have always done, as Homer did when he took those myths as a person they couldn't see and created the Iliad and the Odyssey and wrapped it out, and someone else, thank heavens, wrote it down, telling a story, drawing on the beauties of the past and creating something from that. Easier said than done, but that's what they did. And that means that's something that we could all do in our own way.
And that sounds like a great introduction to the Autry Route 66 exhibition, which brought together the Jack Kerouac Scroll of On the Road and some Woody Guthrie elements. And we have with us Jim Farber, one of the creators and idea people behind that exhibition. He's here.
Yes, I'm here. Am I on now? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're
Yes.
on.
Well,
Welcome.
the crossover, the basis of the Route 66 exhibit was how different generations of Americans experienced Route 66 in entirely different ways. And the Route 66 of Woody Guthrie is not the Route 66 of Jack Kerouac. Route 66 of Woody Guthrie is the road of flight. It is the road of escape from the Dust Bowl toward what they hoped would be the paradise of California. What was intriguing about the Jack Kerouac Route 66, at least the way I interpreted it and the way working with Jim Canary, is the idea that the Route 66 becomes the road as experience, the road as a chance of encounter, chance encounter, a different dharma of being and looking for a different dharma, not, in plight and horror, which was really the world of the Dust Bowl. But Jim is the crossover. And Dina, you and I worked together, didn't we, with Bob Centella when we were putting Route 66 together? Because right. Two very key figures in this exhibit were Jim Canary from both the Jack Kerouac perspective, and you may not realize that at Indiana University, where Jim is, they also have the John Ford Archive. And so you have the crossover of the Grapes of Wrath, Woody Guthrie, Kerouac, all sort of mixed up. And Bob Centella is the other key figure in this. And Bob is the great practitioner and putter together of Woody Guthrie experiences. But I had forgotten that we worked together when you just opened the experience in Tulsa. And I've been there. It's wonderful. It's a great place and everyone should visit there.
Thank you. That's, it was a joy to work with you. I think you may have been one of the first, or at least one of the first two or three that we actually loaned items to and developed that relationship with. I believe you borrowed the lyrics to Will Rogers' Highway that you wrote.
We had Do Re Mi.
Do Re Mi. Okay. Oh, lovely. It's good to see you again.
Yeah. That was the Dust Bowl section of the exhibit was exceedingly strong. And the other piece of that part that I was amazingly proud of is we had Steinbeck's original handwritten manuscript of the Grapes of Wrath, which had never been exhibited before. And we had the page where he talks about Route 66 as the road of flight. And diagonally across from that was the Woody Guthrie installation with the guitar and the sheet music. And it was wonderful. And then the scroll, which Jim brought and installed. So it was a good experience. And a lot of people loved that show.
I love that show. Are you going to chime in, Jim Canary?
Well, I haven't. Yeah, it was a wonderful show. it was great to show up there with John Ford's Oscar in one hand and the scroll in the other. But the other thing, I had a question for Dina. I'm just very, thought it was just wonderful that Bob Dylan's archives ended up there in Tulsa as well. And I didn't know if you could speak a little about that connection.
About the archives
Yeah.
themselves. Well, the same foundation, the George Kaiser Family Foundation, purchased the Woody Guthrie Archive, and that same foundation purchased Dylan's archive. So they're they're investing in Tulsa, but doing so through these historic music archives.
Mhm.
There's another one that apparently they've got another one on tap that's coming down the pike that's also going to make some noise. So can't say anything about that. But the Bob Dylan Center itself, which will be right beside Woody, of course,
Yeah.
will be open the fall of 2021. So Woody and Bob will be there together. It was shortly after the foundation purchased Bob's archive. He was in town for a show he was doing just down the street from us and stopped in to take a little tour of, we'd seen Jeff Rosen several times. He'd come through and gone through our facility, through our archive to see how things were done. But Dylan himself hadn't been in until afterwards, and he came in, and it was an amazing experience, just showing him Woody's stuff and talking about the things that Woody left behind. I think he probably is going to steal a song lyric that Woody would go through and write down on ledger books song title ideas, one right after the other, just on each page had a song title. And then sometimes he would come back and actually write the song, and sometimes not. And this particular book we were looking through, he hadn't written very many of the songs that he had put down titles for, but he always alphabetized a list of the songs that he had written down, the titles. So at the beginning, you've got this alphabetized. So for somebody who people don't think was very organized, Woody was very organized. So he had this alphabetized list at the front of this ledger book. And Dylan had me get that out a couple of times, and he was studying just all of those song titles. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I need to pay attention to what you produce in the next few years. You're going to steal a song title, aren't you? But it was very amazing to, as I'm showing them the crate that has the doors from the ward of Greystone State Hospital, and talking about those and the fact that we're going to get them sealed so that people can see them, because I think it's important for them to see these institutional doors where Woody was hospitalized, and to have Bob Dylan look at me and say, yeah, I went through those doors before. And I'm thinking, oh my God, yeah, you did. You did. You were there when other people were struggling to go and see Woody, because it was during the later years. But yeah, so lots of things going on. And the idea is that for anybody researching Americana music and its history, that Tulsa is the place to come. Our archive was also the source for the most recent, there's a new book about Phil Oakes' writing, and our archive was the source of all of that material as well. Phil's daughter and his family donated all of his things to us. So again, we want Tulsa to be this mecca for research for Americana music history.
Great.
It also is going to become the center where there's going to be the Route 66 experience if it's completed, which would be, because Tulsa is where east meets west on Route 66.
Hmm.
And it's just a great convergence. And believe me, don't sell Tulsa short. It is a great little town.
Well, and I've been telling people for several years that Tulsa has been we've had this secret, and has to get ready because the secret's out. I mean, you see all of this incredible music that comes from musicians in Oklahoma, and it has to do with I mean, it has to do with Route 66. It has to do with the location of the state. It's in the heartland. So we're taking influences from all directions and then mashing it together, and you come up with this amazingly unique sound, the red dirt sound that David Amram hangs out with in the summertime and hangs out with our red dirt musicians. But there's a lot of stuff going on, and you definitely.
May I ask a question? Because if you're speaking of Oklahoma and natives, is there any talk of a native part, or is there any kind of a Native American part of the museum?
Not at our museum. There is a Native American museum in Oklahoma that's being developed in Oklahoma City.
Nice.
Could I comment on that?
Yeah.
In 1956, the same time that I met Kerouac and Woody Guthrie, I was playing with Oscar Pettiford from a place called Okmulgee, Oklahoma, about 8 miles from Tulsa. And Oscar was a member of a 13-piece family band. He was Native American and African American heritage. And he told me way back about how the Native Americans, or American Indians as they were called at that time, and the jazz players and the folk players all hung out together. Fast forwarding years later, I was invited to become a member of the Oklahoma Jazz Hall of Fame because I was the only person currently alive who had played in those historic 1956 recordings. Julius Watkins and I were the horn players. And I mentioned always about Oscar Pettiford and the Oklahoma roots. So when they made me a member of the museum, I saw all these pictures. I said, man, I'm honored to be part of this. You're so nice to have so many people, in addition, not just Dave Brubeck and me, but all these other players who weren't from Oklahoma. They said they were all from Oklahoma. I said, what? And these are guys I had played with: Buddy Tate, Chet Baker, whom I never realized was from Yale, Oklahoma. I won't go down the list. Even Barney Kessel. I never knew until I was in the Hall of Fame there that these people that I played with as a kid in the 40s and as a young man in the 50s and then young, not quite so young, in the 60s were monster great musicians. All were from Oklahoma. And that's only the jazz players. And all of those players, I remember, all loved folk music and played like in Austin, Texas at that time when the symphony, jazz, folk, everybody had their own language, but they appreciated everyone else's language, everyone else's gift and way of doing stuff, and had respect and shared in that beauty. So when I'm hanging out with the Red Dirt Rangers, I'm not doing it as a tourist. I'm not going slumming or thinking I'm doing somebody a favor. I'm continuing to learn some of that magic that's unique to Oklahoma. There's a place called the Colony Bar, and someone named who played at the folk festival, Don, a great bass player, said, "You got to come to church." I said, "Oh, of course. What day will that be?" He said, "Wednesday night." I said, "Man, what kind of a church is Wednesday night?" He said, "No. It's called the Colony. We call it church. You go there, you'll see what I mean." And I went there, and sure enough, it was just like when I played at the 125 Club in Harlem, when I went there with Oscar Pettiford and with Mingus and those people I was playing with, or when I went to places in New Orleans or in Memphis, Tennessee, or in Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., or places in Indiana Avenue and Indianapolis where they have incredible, or the Beehive in Chicago, places that were temples of art that were just little bars where everyone got together and created beautiful music. And that's a spirit thing. And that's something, hopefully, I'm sure they'll have a Native American museum. But in the meantime, the spirit of that Native American spirit, which Pamela was mentioning, fills every place and everywhere and is part of Oklahoma. I don't understand it, and I don't think any of us understand it. And that's the beautiful thing about music and art and poetry and life itself. It's a gift, and it's something that's larger than us that we don't understand, but we say, man, I want to get close to that and closer to that and respect it and feel it and learn something about it while I'm here. And that's the wonderful part that can't be institutionalized, can't be branded. The wonderful thing about the Woody Guthrie Center is it's not a big cement vault with a bunch of formaldehyde drops in a bottle dispensed by an authority who hates being there. And they're not guards with clubs to beat you over the head if you get too close to the artwork. It's a place that's filled with that spirit, beautifully organized, and most important, makes you feel welcome and staffed by young people from that community who don't want to go to the Kennedy Center, London or Paris or Buckingham Palace, but love their hometown, want to stay there, and want other people to come too. And every place that I've been that has that magical spirit always is inviting. There's always a welcome mat, not a no trespassing mat, or who are you, or how dare you think you're welcome here. That it's always open and warm and welcoming. And that's a beautiful thing, not just for Tulsa, but for the whole USA and the whole world, where every small town can honor people of distinction, as Tulsa does now with all these great people who are from Oklahoma, as Lowell, Massachusetts is finally doing with Jack Kerouac in his hometown, and as we're finding, just like there's a Mozart house in Austria, and there's a Beethoven house in Bonn, and there's a Shakespeare home in England, there's also places all over the world where we honor people who have contributed something, so the people coming up can say, man, we don't have to leave town in order to be something or somebody. There's already somebody here that gave us their gift, and we're honoring that gift, that heritage.
And may I ask Dina a question? How did you, because you seem so well suited for what you're doing, but what were the steps that got you there? How did you become who you are with Woody Guthrie?
Okay, so I was on the founding board for the Woody Guthrie Folk Festival, and so I was involved with the music and the family through that. I also had we had Bob Santelli, who James has mentioned before, the founding executive director of the Grammy Museum in LA, came to the festival a couple of times. Honestly, it was all very serendipitous.
Great, man.
Oh, there we go. So it was, I had a musician friend, our friend Jimmy LaFave, who had Thanksgiving dinner with Bob Santelli, and called me shortly after and said, hey, Dina, you know that Woody place they're building in Tulsa? Just had dinner with Bob Santelli. They're having trouble finding people to run it. And when I mentioned you, he said, make sure to have her to call me. And so I sent Bob a message and said, hey, Bob, what's the deal? Do you need anything? Jimmy says you're having trouble finding people. What can I do to help? And he said, send me your resume. And I said, okay. And sent him my resume. And I said, did I just apply for? And he said, yes, you did. And okay. I thought I was applying for the education and programs manager because I'm a classroom teacher, librarian. I'd been running a festival, and I went and talked with Bob, and he said, no, you're applying for the wrong job. I want you to run the place. I said, okie doke, that sounds like fun. I can do that, sure. So I had the right credentials and knew the right, I mean, I had the experience with the family. They trusted me. I had connections with the musicians, which was important. I had the right, I had my master's was in the right, one of the right categories, but mostly it was just, they knew what I could bring and trusted me to do that. So it was a weird series of events, and it's all due to our friend Jimmy LaFave.
Serendipity.
Yeah.
And the way you say okie doke, perhaps.
Yes. All right. I got it. Yeah. So it was interesting, but it was lovely that Nora and her family were right on board in endorsing me, because I know that they, part of what my job is making sure that I protect Woody from over commercialization, that I am the spokesperson for him. I'm the Woody Guthrie subject matter expert on staff. And it meant a lot to me that they trusted me to be that voice for Woody. So yeah.
Bravo.
Really beautiful. They're
So
lucky to have you.
hey guys, I have a little comment for Dina and James actually, or a little something to spur on conversation maybe. But James, you had mentioned that Route 66 meant different things to Jack and to Woody. It was, these different points of views and perspective. And so I actually grew up on Route 66 myself in a little town called Rancho Cucamonga. In our town, it was Foothill Boulevard was Route 66.
Right.
And that is something that I kind of took for granted my entire life. Like I always knew that it was a thing, but like until I started working with David and really getting, familiar with the material of all of these people during that time and, looking at Americana in that way, I hadn't made that connection before. And just the other day, Pamela actually sent me a quote from Woody Guthrie and then another quote from Nina Simone, which I'd like to read to you guys really quick because it kind of ties into everything. So the quote from Nina Simone is, "There's no excuse for the young people not knowing who the heroes and heroines are or were." And kind of guilty of that myself, but it's been like a really illuminating process getting to work with David on this show and getting to learn about all of these things, because I really feel like I come from that maybe third perspective on Route 66 where you're not even aware of the history that came before you. And I am in the spirit of Woody Guthrie, happy to be changing and evolving the more that I learn and the more that people like you are able to come on the show and, speak to us. So I want to thank you guys so much for, taking your time and being here.
Thank you.
And
I want
yeah.
to say one thing. I'd like to make one point about Route 66, and this was the way I envisioned the show. The show was actually called Route 66, The Road and the Romance. And my concept was if you drove the exhibit one way, you saw the romance, you saw the TV series, you saw, all the glorification. But if you drove it the other way, you saw the cop behind the billboard. You saw the bum who was, being told he couldn't, stay in town until after the sun went down. And I'm very proud to say we had in our exhibit a whole section, a gallery devoted to prejudice on Route 66. And we had a green book in the exhibit long before the movie. When most people, I would try to find one, and antiquarian book dealers didn't have the faintest idea what a green book was, which was kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Anyway, that aspect of the road was not friendly to everybody by any means.
Well, Jim, I thought one of the greatest things as a curator of that exhibit was that you went and did the whole road yourself the year or two before that, just to really experience it, meet the people in different places along the way, and bringing many of them actually to the exhibit and the opening. That was wonderful.
It was,
Really did
by
your
the
work.
way, this is a great American experience that I urge everybody at some point in your life to do, is to drive from that corner of in Michigan Avenue where the Institute of Fine Arts is, all the way to the Santa Monica Pier. And you go 2,000 miles on surface streets. But you see an America that's very different. And Michael Wallace, who I'm sure you know, Dina, in Tulsa, Michael's favorite expression is life begins at the off-ramp. When you get off the interstate, that's when you find where life starts. And that's what you get on Route 66.
Could I
Yeah,
remind you of one
yeah,
thing?
go
Just don't forget the song. I got my kicks on Route 66. The reason being, wait a second, if I may. When I traveled there as a teenager, when I was with bands, and when we had black and white musicians playing together, that wasn't done that much at that time. And even though that wasn't supposed to always in the South, they still had the same stuff, plus a lot of other stuff. However, in the spirit of overcoming and being together in spite of everything, in spite of every setback, I Get My Kicks on Route 66 was an overcoming song by everybody who had been kicked in the tuchus, so to speak. But overcame that and still found the beauty part. And the beauty part still remains. And if you could take a train trip through the country and go on those back roads and back places where the superhighways aren't, you get to see some of that. And when you do travel on Route 66, it's still extraordinary. And a lot of horrible stuff happens everywhere, but we don't necessarily remember just the horrible stuff. And prejudice and bigotry has been with us since the country was discovered when Columbus thought he landed in India. However, there's still a beauty part, and a lot of the I get my kicks on Route 66 was a little mantra telling everybody, whatever it is, we can deal with it and still find a way to turn it around and have a good time. And Jack,
It was actually Bobby Troop's wife who came up with the line.
Who's Bobby Troop?
Bobby Troop wrote the song.
Yeah.
Julie London was his wife.
Second wife.
Know that, yeah.
His second wife. His original wife was the one who we traveled west with, who had the map, which we had in the exhibit, by the way, with a collage. We also had a jukebox in the exhibit that had 120 different versions of Route 66 on it that you could listen to.
And
Yeah,
George,
I want
George,
to see that.
yeah, George Maharis was in that show, and I had worked with him on a Jean Genet program way before he was on the program. And he said, well, it was kind of a knockoff of Kerouac and Route 66. It didn't get either. It was a good gig. He was disappointed only because he did a wonderful job acting, and he felt that it was Hollywooded, homogenized, replastic, surgerized, and they cut the heart and soul out of it. But he said maybe people will get to travel on Route 66 and see why they can still have some kicks.
Actually, I have a letter that George wrote to me after he came and saw the exhibit, which is a treasure. It's in the scrapbook of the exhibit, where he writes, I thought I knew the history of the road. Thank you so much. I've learned so much by seeing this exhibit. No, he was great. And we had a 1960 Corvette in the show as an homage.
Do you think we could segue and go look at what Norton is doing? Because he's out of control over there. Norton, before you wipe that away.
Wow, beautiful.
You know, I'll just, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear me?
I hear you, Norton.
Jim Canary, Jim, as you know, Jim, the drive between Indianapolis and Bloomington, that's kind of a gnarly drive as far as bigotry.
Oh my gosh, yes.
It's got a big history, man. I've driven that because I performed in Bloomington many times, and I make sure my nuts and bolts are tightened down when I try to get out of town, man. As
You don't want any. You want to make sure all your taillights are working.
Oh my God. Anyway, I don't mean to be silly, but there's good people everywhere, but it was what's so interesting, because I thought the same thing today, is the great thing about human beings. The human species is about being able to adapt, and it's amazing. Within no time at all, humanity adapted to this virus. We got together and we realized, okay, if we're gonna evolve, we're gonna be here. Masks away. We put masks, and the part of humanity that's not able to evolve didn't wear masks. You can spot them everywhere. They don't have the inside, the humanity, I guess, to participate in this evolution. And I was thinking that today, and you guys were covering that as it's silliness, but anyway, that's how the as Jung would say, our collective unconscious is weaving itself together on this program that Anthony was talking about. I also have to say that, Anthony, you speak for me too. It's a great pleasure, you know what I mean, to listen to these wonderful journeys, and I've toured them quite a few times with jazz groups, and the Green Book. I know all about it, man. So anyway, all my love, everybody.
Great. Could we
Thank
have
you,
some
Norton.
question? Could we have some questions? We do that every week. Some question. I'm sure some people want to ask Dina a question before they come to Tulsa and go to the museum, at which point they'll have some answers. Would somebody in the Zoom audience like to ask Dina or any of us, especially Dina, a question or a comment? And accepting the invitation, I can see Doug Yeager is there. I see him in the car. Doug, do you want to ask a question or say something to encourage everybody in the Zoom audience to overcome their shyness?
Hello, I don't know if my audio is on.
Yes.
I hear you, Doug. Hello.
Hello, hello, hello. And I just want to say hello to my dear friend Dina. And the Woody Guthrie Center is one of the most fabulous places anyone will ever want to visit and to learn. And several people have mentioned how the Dust Bowl exhibit is so powerful, and it is. I mean, you're just caught up with how those people were living during those months in the 30s. And but Woody went on to write 3,000 songs. And he's just this very unique and special genius in American history. And I do see a lot of correlations between Woody and Jack and their personalities, and somewhat being an outsider, always looking in and writing about it. So there were similarities between the two. And thank you, Dina, for all the work you do.
It's my pleasure. It's good to see your face, Doug. One thing I was going to mention as well, in addition to the Bob Dylan Center, next year, I think it's probably fall of next year as well, there's a new museum that's being built just a couple of blocks away from us called Greenwood Rising, which is on Greenwood and Archer, which is where Black Wall Street was. And the end of May 2021 will be the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, where 40 blocks of an incredible community was burned down in the worst mass race massacre in our history. There's still estimates are that over 350 people were killed, but it was all hidden from newspapers. You know, if I know that it's being, that there's more publicity, there's more historical documentation coming out now about the events and the horrific scenes that took place. So also I'd encourage anybody who is interested in learning a little bit more about the history of Tulsa to explore that a little. I mean, it's a horrible event in our history, but it certainly is something we need to learn from. And, you know, to me, it's always been this beautiful irony that on this land that was literally burned down because of racism and violence and bigotry, that's where Woody Guthrie's museum is, where we are promoting the idea of diversity, equality, and social justice. And that there is a new energy going into the Greenwood area and trying to reverse the systemic racism that has happened since 1921. So.
Yeah, Dina, Nelson Harrison here. I really want to thank you and Jim both, but thank you so much for presenting that. And when you just mentioned the Tulsa race riots, that's really, I was hoping somebody would mention that.
Yeah.
I teach psychology right now, and I make sure I mention that to my students. And then that was 21, and in 1923, same thing happened in Rosewood, Florida. And we started to get close to it again in these past few years. I'm glad you mentioned that in your opening statement. I was only in Tulsa once. I played at Ziegfeld's. I was traveling with Count Basie's band, and we played at Ziegfeld's one night, and then from there we went to Dallas. And for David, that was a significant night. You might remember, David, Charlie Folks, who played baritone sax with Count Basie. Well, that was his swan song at Ziegfeld's, because he sat behind me on the bus. And on our way to Dallas, we were going to Dallas the next day to play with the Petroleum Fraternity. And he died on the bus sitting behind me.
Oh, my.
And it was snowing outside, so we couldn't see much out the windows. But when we got to Dallas, he was sitting with his face down. And I actually took 2 pictures of him while he was sitting there. He had a stroke in his sleep, and it just looked like he was asleep. When I got on the bus, Eric Dixon was behind me. He says, "Take a picture of Poopsie." That's what we called him. So I took 2 pictures of him. And when we got to Dallas, Freddie Green sat across the aisle from him, and he punched him on the shoulder and said, "Poopsie, wake up." And he didn't move. Well, he was like 6'4", and his leg was down the side of my chair. And I reached down and grabbed his calf, and it was cold as ice. And I said, "Oh my God, he's gone." So the Count sat in the front seat up in the front of the bus. So we had to send the word to him that Poopsie died. He got up and he said, "He's probably walking around here wondering why nobody's talking to him. He probably doesn't even know he's dead." You know? So, but that was one of the nights I recorded a lot when I was on the road. And the second set that night, I put my tape recorder right by his feet. And that was the last set he played, and I have the baritone sax loud in my tape recorder of his swan song. So I'll never forget Tulsa for that reason alone.
And for those of you that aren't familiar with Dr. Nelson Harrison, whom you just heard, he has a wonderful website showing that Pittsburgh is, and will always be the land of the giant killers. And you can learn more about music. And just like Tulsa, learn of all the fantastic musicians who came from there and who come from there. And that's just one of the examples of what is happening all around the country. And that's the beautiful part of the internet. Hooray, hurrah, hurrah for that, because it means we can get some education and weed through the slop pits and find those needles in the haystack and learn and see and even virtually visit not only the great Woody Guthrie Center in Tulsa, but you can also see the history of Crawford Grill in Pittsburgh and learn about that. And as someone who was born in Pennsylvania, I knew 75% of those musicians who were mentioned there, and I never realized most of them came from Pittsburgh. So we all are here to learn. And now the next generation doesn't have to go out and hang out till 4 a.m. to get someone to give them some information. You can find it yourself right at home. Nelson Harrison on.
By the way, David, you mentioned Beaver Harris. He was a very good friend of mine, too. We're from the same neighborhood, the same high school. Yeah.
He said, they always say that we're late. He said, but whenever the musicians show up and we play, we're right on time. He had the 360-degree music experience.
Right.
And he used to say, people said, Beaver, you're ahead of your time. And he said the classic line, no, I'm right on time.
May I ask a question? Speaking of Bob Dylan, Jim Canary, did Jim Irsay purchase a guitar of Bob Dylan's? You need to unmic again, please.
Yeah, Jim's a huge Dylan fan, and he had he bought the Stratocaster that Dylan picked up at Newport and made that transition from folk to electric music. And that was also on display at the American Writers Museum in Chicago. The first author, as I said before, that they featured at that museum was Jack Kerouac. Then the third person they featured was Bob Dylan. So, yeah, they hang together pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dina, I have another quote here from Pamela that is relating to your point earlier about Woody constantly being in the state of change and motion throughout his life. And I thought that was really great. life has got a habit of not standing hitched. You got to write it like you find it. You got to change with it. If a day goes by that don't change some of your old notions for new ones, that is just about like trying to milk a dead cow. And I thought that was brilliant. Like,
Well, I thought it was funny because when I read that quote, I heard Anthony's voice, and as Anthony's explained, he's learning a lot as he goes along with us. He's got his own science brain that's crazy, and from the voice of Woody Guthrie to hear my friend, I thought was interesting that all of these people that we're looking into are just as pertinent, of course, then as they are now, and with some education on the past, even more pertinent and significant. So I'm just thrilled to be here with you all that have all this information.
Hey, Pamela.
Yes.
Hey, David, can I try something?
Yes.
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna play a little theme and variations. This isn't the one I wrote for the symphony. This would be spontaneous in the spirit of Zoom, and you can watch Anthony paint a little bit. And again, for those of you who tuned in late,
Norton's gonna paint, but he wants to say something.
David, no, I wanted to do because we were talking, or the big conversation was about fleeing the Dust Bowl. I was going to show you a close-up to see how this looks on how I interpreted the conversation. I don't know if you can see it.
oh yeah,
Is that
terrific? Well, what you do is your own thing, which is so beautiful. And ladies and gentlemen, for those of you not familiar, he does these and then he erases them and does something else just as terrific at the same time. Unfortunately, he's photographed some of the ones he changes, which are a whole museum and book. And that's what we talked about. Formality and spontaneity, those are related.
That's fantastic, Norton.
Oh,
I don't know if you could see it any better, but anyway.
Yeah, it's great.
It was the thing that drove these paintings. All right. Thank you.
So Norton, this will be, we usually play a farewell song because we don't want to go overtime and bankrupt the program. But to all of you who came, if you tuned in late, we want to thank Pamela Dickerson, who without her, I'd be home watching CNN or really be depressed. We all would. And
without
secondly,
Anthony, you'd be doing the same.
And secondly, Anthony Demarbier, who is now the producer, and Pamela has now become the creative director, creative organizer, and of course, our wonderful special guest, Dina McLeod at the wonderful Woody Guthrie Center in Tulsa. Please go there, bring your friends and your family. Also, we thank so much our special guest who founded the Route 66 exhibit, which is, we hope, will become even more well-known thanks to this program. People can tell their friends, look it up. And James Canary, the keeper of the scroll, and of course, Norton Wisdom. And this will be a little theme and variation. And then we bid you adieu and hope that you'll all have a wonderful Christmas, Hanukkah, Ramadan, St. Patrick's Day, Kwanzaa, Armenian International Women's Liberation Day, Chinese New Year, Puerto Rican Independence Day, whatever, Ramadan, whatever you celebrate them all because they're all beautiful and we all have our own way of celebrating that great spirit.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dina. And in a minute, we're going to run the Bruce video. Thank you. Thanks, Joyce. Thank you, Hassan, Dr. Harrison, Jim, the other Jim, all the Jim, Norton, Anthony, Dina.
Thank you all, and good night, and see you next week. Have a beautiful Christmas if you celebrate that, and whatever else you do. Have